Detective Tommy Blake stared at the stack of bills on his kitchen table, his coffee growing cold as the numbers blurred together. Rent was due in 3 days, his car payment was already 2 weeks late, and the credit card companies had started calling twice a day. But those weren't even his biggest problems. The real nightmare was Vincent Caruso and his crew. Tommy had made the mistake of thinking he could beat the house at Caruso's underground poker games. What started as a few $100s in friendly bets had snowballed into a debt that now sat at $15,000, and Caruso wasn't the type of guy who accepted payment plans. Tommy rubbed his tired eyes and looked around his small apartment. Being a cop was supposed to be about serving and protecting, but after 12 years on the force, all he had to show for it was a cramped one-bedroom place in a sketchy neighborhood and a bank account that never seemed to have enough money. His phone buzzed. Another text from Caruso's people. "Time's running out, cop. Pay up or face the music." Tommy's hands shook as he deleted the message. He'd already sold everything valuable he owned. His grandfather's watch, his motorcycle, even his college ring. Nothing was enough. That's when the idea first crept into his head. He'd been working the night shift for months, pulling over cars in the wealthy part of town. Rich people always seemed to have something to hide, and they definitely had money to throw around. Tommy had noticed how nervous some drivers got during routine stops, how quickly they offered to work something out when he mentioned calling for backup or towing their expensive cars. At first, he pushed the thoughts away. He was a good cop, or at least he used to be. His father had been a police officer and his grandfather too. The Blake family had a reputation to uphold, but as the debt collectors got more aggressive and Caruso's threats became more specific, Tommy's moral compass started spinning. The first time he crossed the line was almost by accident. He'd pulled over a nervous businessman driving a BMW who clearly had been drinking. Instead of arresting him, Tommy had accepted $500 to let the guy drive home. It was wrong, but it was also easy money and nobody got hurt. The businessman went home safe and Tommy could finally pay his electric bill. But $500 didn't last long when you owed $15,000. Tommy needed a bigger score, something that would give him real leverage. That's when he remembered the evidence locker and all those confiscated drugs that were supposed to be destroyed. Late one night, Tommy slipped into the evidence room. His hands were sweating as he carefully removed small amounts of powder from bags that were scheduled for destruction. Nobody would miss these tiny portions, he told himself. And if he was smart about it, he could use them to create situations that would pay much better than letting drunk drivers go home. The plan was simple but effective. Tommy would target drivers in expensive cars, especially in neighborhoods where people had money and reputations to protect. During routine traffic stops, he would find excuses to search their vehicles and then discover the planted evidence. Most people would panic and offer to pay anything to make the problem disappear. Tommy practiced the technique in his apartment, learning to palm the small baggies and plant them smoothly. He studied the wealthy parts of town, figuring out the best spots to set up his operation. He even researched which types of people were most likely to pay rather than fight the charges. The first few attempts were clumsy, but Tommy learned from each encounter. He discovered that confidence was key. If he acted like he'd seen it all before, if he spoke with authority about serious charges and mandatory jail time, people would believe him. Fear made them desperate, and desperate people made poor decisions. Within a month, Tommy had collected over $3,000. It wasn't enough to pay off Caruso completely, but it bought him time and kept the loan sharks from breaking his legs. More importantly, it proved the system worked. He was making more money in a few hours of planted evidence than he made in weeks of regular police work. Tommy became more sophisticated in his approach. He studied his targets carefully, choosing people who looked like they had both money and something to lose. Business executives, doctors, lawyers, anyone who couldn't afford a scandal. He learned to read body language to identify the people who would pay quickly versus those who might cause trouble. The money was addictive. For the first time in years, Tommy could pay his bills without stress. He bought new clothes, fixed his car, and even started saving money. But more importantly, he was making progress on his debt to Caruso. Every successful stop brought him closer to freedom from the gangsters' threats. Tommy told himself he was being smart about it. He never planted large amounts of drugs, nothing that would suggest serious dealing. He chose his locations carefully, avoiding areas with security, cameras or heavy police presence. He kept detailed mental notes about which neighborhoods had already been worked to avoid establishing patterns that might attract attention. As weeks turned into months, Tommy's confidence grew. He'd figured out the perfect crime, a way to make easy money from people who could afford to lose it. Rich folks had insurance, expensive lawyers, and connections that would help them bounce back from minor scandals. Tommy was just redistributing wealth from people who had too much to someone who desperately needed it. But success made Tommy careless. He started taking bigger risks, targeting more expensive cars, and asking for larger payments. The thrill of the con became almost as addictive as the money itself. Tommy began to see himself as smarter than everyone around him, a master manipulator who had found a foolproof way to beat the system. On this particular Tuesday evening, the rain was coming down hard, creating perfect conditions for Tommy's operation. Bad weather made people drive more carefully, giving him plenty of reasons to pull cars over for minor infractions. The streets were mostly empty except for the occasional luxury vehicle heading home from late dinners or business meetings. Tommy had been cruising through Riverside Heights, one of the city's most expensive neighborhoods, when he spotted his next target. A sleek black Mercedes sedan with tinted windows was driving slowly through the quiet streets. The car was worth at least $80,000, which meant the driver had serious money. From his position behind the Mercedes, Tommy could see the driver was a woman, probably in her 40s, wearing what looked like expensive business clothes. Everything about the situation screamed money and reputation, exactly the combination Tommy had learned to exploit. As he flipped on his lights and prepared to make the stop, Tommy felt the familiar rush of adrenaline. This was going to be another successful night, another step closer to paying off Caruso and getting his life back on track. He had no idea that he was about to make the biggest mistake of his career, one that would destroy everything he'd worked for and land him in federal prison. The Mercedes pulled over immediately, and Tommy smiled to himself. Cooperative drivers were always the best targets. They followed instructions, didn't ask too many questions, and usually paid up quickly when faced with serious charges. This was going to be easy money, just like all the others. Tommy had no way of knowing that the woman behind the wheel was anything but an easy target. He couldn't have imagined that his carefully planned operation was about to fall apart in the most spectacular way possible. Tommy walked slowly toward the Mercedes, his flashlight cutting through the rain as he approached the driver's side window. The car was even more impressive up close. Pristine black paint, chrome details that probably cost more than his monthly salary. This was definitely going to be a profitable stop. The window rolled down smoothly, and Tommy got his first good look at the driver. She was an African-American woman, probably in her mid-40s, with short professional hair and wearing what looked like a very expensive business suit. Her makeup was perfect despite the late hour, and she wore subtle but clearly expensive jewelry. Everything about her screamed success and money, but what struck Tommy most was her composure. Most people got nervous when pulled over, especially at night in the rain. They fumbled for their license, apologized repeatedly, or asked anxiously what they'd done wrong. This woman did none of that. She sat calmly with her hands visible on the steering wheel, looking directly at him with steady, intelligent eyes. "Good evening, officer," she said in a clear, confident voice. "Is there a problem?" Tommy flashed his badge and put on his most official voice. "License and registration, please, ma'am. Routine traffic stop." The woman reached smoothly into her purse, no sudden movements, no nervous chatter. She handed over her documents with the same calm confidence she'd shown from the start. Tommy examined the license under his flashlight. Dr. Angela Washington, age 43, address in the most exclusive part of town. The registration showed the Mercedes, was barely 6 months old. "Dr. Washington," Tommy said, making a mental note of her professional title. Doctors had serious money and even more serious reputations to protect. "Do you know why I stopped you tonight?" She looked at him steadily. "No, officer, I don't. I was driving the speed limit, my registration is current, and I haven't been drinking. I'm heading home from a late meeting downtown. Her directness caught Tommy off guard. Most people in expensive cars immediately started making excuses or trying to explain themselves. This woman was treating the stop like a business transaction, calm and matter-of-fact. It was almost like she'd been through this before, but not in the way most people had. Tommy studied her face in the flashlight beam. She wasn't showing any of the usual signs of nervousness. No rapid blinking, no fidgeting with her hands, no rambling explanations. If anything, she seemed to be studying him just as carefully as he was studying her. Well, Dr. Washington, I observed some erratic driving back there. Swerving slightly, inconsistent speed. I need to make sure you're fit to drive safely. Tommy was making it up as he went along, but he'd used similar excuses dozens of times before. I see, she said simply. She didn't argue or protest. She didn't point out that the roads were wet and everyone was driving carefully. She just nodded slightly as if filing away information. Tommy felt his first hint of unease. This woman was too calm, too controlled. Most people would be getting agitated by now, especially innocent people who knew they hadn't done anything wrong. But Dr. Washington sat there like she was in a boardroom, completely in control of herself and the situation. I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle, ma'am. Standard safety inspection. This was the moment when most people started to panic a little. Being asked to get out of the car escalated things, made the stop feel more serious. Tommy had learned that this was when people began calculating how much trouble they might be in and how much they'd pay to make it go away. Dr. Washington simply nodded and began to unbuckle her seatbelt. Of course, officer. She stepped out of the Mercedes with the same calm grace she'd shown throughout the stop. Even in the rain, even standing on the side of the road at night, she maintained perfect posture and composure. Tommy noticed she was tall, probably close to his own height, and she moved with the confidence of someone used to being in charge. Please step over here by the patrol car, Tommy directed, gesturing toward his cruiser. This was part of his routine. Get the target away from their vehicle so they couldn't see exactly what he was doing during the search. Dr. Washington walked where he indicated, her expensive heels clicking on the wet pavement. She stood with her arms at her sides, not crossing them defensively like most people did. She wasn't checking her phone or looking around nervously. She was simply waiting, watching him with those same steady, intelligent eyes. Tommy opened the driver's door of the Mercedes and began his inspection. The interior was immaculate, leather seats that probably cost more than his couch, a dashboard with more technology than his apartment, and that new car smell that meant serious money. The glove compartment was perfectly organized, the center, console spotless. As he pretended to conduct a thorough search, Tommy kept glancing back at Dr. Washington. She was standing exactly where he'd told her to stand, but something about her posture suggested she was watching his every move. It was subtle, but Tommy had developed good instincts about people during his years as a cop. This woman was paying attention to everything. Tommy moved to the passenger side, keeping up his act of checking for safety violations or anything suspicious. But his real focus was on the small baggie in his pocket, the one that would soon become Dr. Washington's very expensive problem. He'd done this routine so many times it was automatic. Palm the evidence, plant it where it would be easily found, discover it with appropriate shock and concern. The rain was getting heavier, and Tommy could feel water running down his collar. He wanted to wrap this up quickly and get to the important part, the negotiation that would put serious money in his pocket. Dr. Washington clearly had wealth and status to protect. She'd probably pay $5,000, maybe even $10,000, to make drug charges disappear. But as Tommy prepared to make his move, something nagged at him about the woman's behavior. She was too calm, too professional, too observant. Most people in her situation would be asking questions by now. They'd want to know what he was looking for, how much longer this would take, whether they could call someone. Dr. Washington had asked none of those questions. Tommy shook off his doubts. He'd been doing this for months without problems. Rich. People were all the same when faced with serious criminal charges. They paid up and moved on with their lives. Dr. Washington might be calmer than most, but she'd react just like all the others when she realized what kind of trouble she was in. He reached into his pocket and felt the familiar shape of the small plastic baggie. The powder inside would be enough to suggest personal use, serious. Enough to create fear, but not so much that it looked like dealing. Tommy had learned the perfect amount through trial and error. As he prepared to plant the evidence, Tommy took one more look at Dr. Washington. She was still standing where he'd positioned her, still watching him with that same steady gaze. For just a moment, their eyes met through the rain and darkness, and Tommy felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. But he was too far into his routine to stop now. The money was too good, and his debt to Caruso was too real. Tommy turned back to the Mercedes and prepared to change both their lives forever, having no idea that he was about to make the biggest mistake any corrupt cop could possibly make. Tommy stood there in the rain, holding the plastic baggie and waiting for Dr. Washington's response to his $5,000 demand. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the steady patter of raindrops on the pavement and the distant hum of traffic. Something was very wrong with this situation, but Tommy couldn't put his finger on exactly what it was. Dr. Washington reached slowly into her purse, and Tommy felt a surge of relief. She was going for her wallet, ready to pay up just like all the others. Maybe he'd been overthinking things. Maybe her calmness was just shock, and now reality was setting in about how much trouble she was in. But instead of pulling out cash or a checkbook, Dr. Washington's hand emerged with something that made Tommy's blood freeze in his veins. It was a leather credential case, the kind that federal agents carried. She opened it slowly, deliberately, holding it where Tommy could see it clearly under his flashlight. "Officer Blake," she said, her voice still calm but now carrying a weight of authority that made Tommy's knees weak. "Allow me to introduce myself, properly. I'm Dr. Angela Washington, Regional Chief of the Drug Enforcement Administration." Tommy stared at the credentials in disbelief. The federal badge gleamed in the light, official and unmistakably real. The identification card showed Dr. Washington's photo alongside the DEA seal and her title. This wasn't some fake ID bought online. This was the real thing. That's not possible," Tommy stammered, his voice cracking like a teenager's. You're a doctor. You drive a Mercedes. You live in Riverside Heights." Dr. Washington closed the credential case and slipped it back into her purse with the same calm precision she'd shown throughout the entire encounter. "I have a doctorate in criminology, Officer Blake. And yes, I do live in Riverside Heights. Senior federal agents are paid quite well, and I've been doing this job for 18 years. The plastic baggie slipped from Tommy's numb fingers and fell to the wet pavement with a soft plop. His mind was racing, trying to process what this meant. A DEA chief. He'd just tried to shake down the head of the Drug Enforcement Administration. This wasn't just a mistake. This was career suicide. "You've been watching me," Tommy said, the pieces finally clicking together. "The whole time you knew what I was doing." "From the moment you pulled me over," Dr. Washington confirmed. "Your approach was all wrong, Officer Blake. Real traffic. Stops don't begin with vague accusations about erratic driving, especially when the driver hasn't committed any violations. You were clearly targeting me based on my car and appearance, which suggested this wasn't about traffic safety." Tommy's legs felt like rubber. He leaned against the Mercedes for support, his mind reeling with the implications of what had just happened. "How did you know?" Dr. Washington pulled out her phone, and Tommy saw that the screen was lit up with what looked like a recording app. His heart stopped completely as he realized what that meant. "I've been recording this entire encounter," she said matter-of-factly. "Audio and video. I started recording the moment I saw your patrol car in my rearview mirror, because something about your driving pattern suggested you were hunting rather than patrolling." "Recording?" Tommy's voice came out as barely a whisper. "Every word, every action, your illegal search of my vehicle, the moment you planted that evidence in my glove compartment, and your attempt to extort $5,000 in exchange for making false charges disappear." Dr. Washington's voice remained professional, but there was steel underneath it now. "You've committed multiple federal crimes in front of a DEA regional chief, Officer Blake." Tommy felt like he was drowning. The rain seemed to be getting heavier, or maybe it was just his vision blurring as the full weight of his situation crashed down on him. "You can't prove I planted anything. It's your word against mine." Dr. Washington tilted her phone toward him, and Tommy could see his own face reflected in the camera lens. "Actually, I can prove it quite easily. The recording shows you conducting a search with your left hand while your right hand remained hidden. Then, moments later, your right hand emerged with evidence that wasn't there when you began the search." She paused, letting that sink in before continuing. "More importantly, Officer Blake, that baggie you dropped contains powder that will test positive for cocaine, but it won't contain any of my fingerprints, DNA, or any trace evidence linking it to me or my vehicle, because I've never touched it, and it was never in my car until you put it there 3 minutes ago." Tommy's hands were shaking now, and not from the cold rain. Every word she spoke was true, and every word was another nail in his coffin. "Look, Dr. Washington, maybe we can work something out. I made a mistake, okay? I'm in some financial trouble, and I made some bad choices, but we can fix this." "Work something out?" Dr. Washington's eyebrows rose slightly. "Officer Blake, you just attempted to frame a federal agent for drug possession and then tried to extort money to cover up your crime. There's nothing to work out here." Tommy's mind was racing, looking for any possible escape from this nightmare. "What if I give you information? I know things about other cops, about corruption in the department. I could help with investigations." "Officer Blake, I want you to understand something very clearly," Dr. Washington said, her voice taking on the tone of someone who dealt with desperate criminals for nearly 2 decades. "This isn't a negotiation. This isn't a situation where you get to bargain your way out of consequences. You've committed serious federal crimes, and you're going to face the full weight of federal justice." As if summoned by her words, Tommy heard the sound of approaching sirens. Multiple vehicles getting closer fast. His stomach dropped even further as he realized Dr. Washington must have called for backup during their conversation. "You called them," he said numbly. "I called them the moment you asked me to step out of my vehicle," she confirmed. "I knew at that point this was going to end with federal charges. I wanted FBI agents and your department's Internal Affairs Division on scene to handle the arrest properly." The first FBI vehicle pulled up behind Tommy's patrol car, its blue lights cutting through the rain and darkness. 2 agents in dark suits got out, followed quickly by more cars. Internal Affairs investigators, federal marshals, and what looked like crime scene technicians. Tommy watched his career, his freedom, and his entire future disappear in the space of a few seconds. The debt to Caruso seemed like a small problem now compared to federal prison time. "Officer Blake," Dr. Washington said quietly, almost gently, "I want you to know that I take no pleasure in this. I've seen good cops destroyed by desperation and bad choices. But what you've been doing, targeting innocent people, planting evidence, destroying lives for money, that can't be tolerated." One of the FBI agents approached them, and Dr. Washington handed over her phone with the recording. "Agent Collins, this device contains video and audio evidence of evidence tampering, attempted extortion, and violation of civil rights under color of law." Tommy barely heard the Miranda rights being read to him. He was thinking about his father and grandfather, both honest cops who'd served with honor. He was thinking about all the people he'd victimized over the past months, all the lives he'd damaged for his own profit. As the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, Tommy Blake realized that his attempt to solve his problems had just created problems he never could have imagined. The woman he'd thought was an easy target had turned out to be his worst nightmare, a federal agent with 18 years of experience catching people exactly like him. 6 months later, Tommy Blake sat in a federal courtroom wearing an orange jumpsuit, listening to the judge read his sentence. The courtroom was packed with reporters, fellow officers, and members of the community who had followed his case from the beginning. His lawyer sat beside him, having already warned him that the evidence was overwhelming, and a plea deal was his only hope for a lighter sentence. "The defendant will serve 8 years in federal prison," the judge announced, his voice echoing through the silent courtroom. "This sentence reflects the serious nature of evidence tampering, extortion, and civil rights violations committed under color of law." Tommy closed his eyes as the words hit him. 8 years. His career was over, his reputation destroyed, and his future uncertain. But as devastating as the sentence was, it wasn't even the worst part of his story. The investigation that followed. His arrest had uncovered a pattern of corruption that shocked even seasoned federal agents. Dr. Washington's recording had been just the beginning. Once the FBI started digging into Tommy's activities, they found evidence of dozens of similar stops over the past 6 months. Bank records showed regular cash deposits that didn't match Tommy's police salary. Traffic camera footage from various locations revealed suspicious patterns in his patrol routes, always targeting expensive vehicles in wealthy neighborhoods. Most damning of all, laboratory analysis of evidence from previous cases showed irregularities that suggested tampering. The federal task force had worked methodically through Tommy's cases, and the results were staggering. 43 people had been victimized by his scheme. 43 innocent drivers who had been forced to pay money they didn't owe to avoid charges that were completely fabricated. Dr. Washington had testified at the trial, describing in precise detail how she had recognized Tommy's tactics from the moment he pulled her over. Her 18 years of experience fighting drug crimes had taught her to spot the signs of police corruption, and Tommy's approach had raised red flags immediately. "I knew this wasn't a legitimate traffic stop," she had told the court. "Everything about Officer Blake's behavior suggested he was targeting me for reasons unrelated to traffic violations. His questions were designed to create justification for a search, not to address any actual infractions." The recording she had made was played in court, and the jury had listened in stunned silence as Tommy's voice clearly demanded $5,000 to make the planted evidence disappear. Several jury members had shaken their heads in disgust as they watched him plant the drugs and then discover them moments later. But the courtroom drama was only part of the story. The real consequences extended far beyond Tommy's personal downfall. Every case Tommy had touched during his months of corruption had to be reviewed. Defense attorneys filed motion after motion to have their clients' convictions overturned, arguing that any evidence collected by a corrupt officer couldn't be trusted. Even legitimate arrests Tommy had made came under scrutiny. The police department faced a crisis of credibility. Citizens who had been pulled over by Tommy came forward with their own stories of suspicious stops and requests for money. The department was forced to implement new oversight procedures, mandatory body cameras for all officers, and retraining programs focused on ethics and accountability. Vincent Caruso, the loan shark who had started Tommy's spiral into corruption, was arrested 3 weeks after Tommy's trial ended. The federal investigation had followed the money trail from Tommy's bank deposits back to Caruso's illegal gambling operation. Caruso was sentenced to 12 years for racketeering, money laundering, and extortion. The civil lawsuits came next. Every person Tommy had victimized filed suit against both him and the police department. The settlements eventually totaled over $3 million, money that came from taxpayers and the department's insurance fund. The financial impact forced the department to cut training programs and delay equipment upgrades for years. Dr. Washington used the case as a teaching tool, speaking at police academies and law enforcement conferences about recognizing and preventing corruption. She often told the story of that rainy night when a corrupt cop tried to shake down the wrong person, using it to illustrate how small compromises could lead to career-ending disasters. Officer Blake wasn't a bad person who became a cop, she would tell audiences of young police recruits. He was a good cop who made bad choices when faced with financial pressure. The lesson isn't that corruption is inevitable, it's that we need systems in place to help officers before they reach that breaking point. Tommy's family was devastated by the scandal. His father, a retired police officer, refused to speak to him for months. His ex-wife used the conviction to gain full custody of their children, arguing that a convicted felon couldn't provide a stable environment. Tommy's mother visited him in prison but struggled to understand how her son had fallen so far. In prison, Tommy had plenty of time to think about the choices that had led him there. He wrote letters to some of his victims, apologizing for what he had done and trying to explain his desperation. Most of the letters went unanswered, but a few people wrote back, expressing anger and disappointment rather than forgiveness. One letter came from a businessman Tommy had targeted early in his scheme. The man had paid $2,000 to avoid drug charges, money he'd borrowed from his retirement savings. The stress of the encounter and the financial loss had contributed to health problems that landed him in the hospital. "You didn't just steal my money," the man wrote. "You stole my faith in the system I'd always trusted to protect me. Every time I see a police car now, I wonder if the officer is honest or if he's looking for his next payday." Tommy read that letter dozens of times, understanding for the first time the real damage his crimes had caused. It wasn't just about the money. It was about trust, safety, and the fundamental belief that police officers existed to serve and protect, rather than to exploit and extort. Dr. Washington continued her work fighting drug crimes, but the case had given her a new perspective on police corruption. She worked with federal prosecutors to develop new training programs for identifying corrupt officers and implemented systems for anonymous reporting of suspicious police behavior. The Mercedes that Tommy had searched that night became part of DEA legend. Dr. Washington kept the car for years, sometimes joking with colleagues that it was the most expensive piece of evidence collection equipment the agency had ever purchased. The story of how a corrupt cop tried to shake down a DEA chief spread throughout law enforcement circles, becoming a cautionary tale about assumptions and consequences. 5 years into his sentence, Tommy was eligible for early release due to good behavior and his cooperation with ongoing corruption investigations. He had helped federal agents identify other officers involved in similar schemes, though none as extensive as his own operation. When Tommy finally walked out of federal prison, he was a different man than the desperate cop who had pulled over Dr. Washington that rainy night. He'd lost everything: his career, his family, his reputation, and 8 years of his life. But he'd also gained something: an understanding of how quickly good people could become criminals when they chose shortcuts over principles. The case became a landmark example of justice served and corruption exposed. It showed that no one was above the law, and that sometimes the person you target turns out to be exactly the wrong person to mess with. Dr. Washington's calm professionalism that night had brought down a corrupt officer and helped clean up an entire police department, proving that sometimes the best defense against crime is simply being prepared for it.